Now, as Paul said, the really big story yesterday was about the economy, about the economic downgrade. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, about how big it is, how that compares to other countries, and then think about the consequences for the public finances, both in the medium term and also the longer term. So here this chart shows productivity since the start of the millennium. And you can see that since the financial crisis, really productivity has basically flatlined. And that's not what the OBR has very consistently expected. This shows successive forecasts since the OBR started forecasting in 2010. And they've continually expected productivity growth would return to something like the pre-crisis trend of about 2%. Clearly, that's not proved to be the case so far, and they no longer think that. So what happened yesterday? What's the new forecast? Well, the new forecast is now significantly below the pre-crisis trend of 2%, but it is still quite a lot above the post-crisis trend of little more than zero growth since about 2010. So while this is a very significant downgrade, although OBR is now much more pessimistic than they were before, this is still predicting an uptick in productivity relative to what we've seen over the past decade or so. Now, productivity is one of the key drivers of economic growth. There have been two very large downgrades to productivity, to economic growth, since March 2016. That was less than 2 years ago. And we now expect real GDP growth to not exceed 1.5% in any year over the next 5. And that's really pretty pessimistic. So what does this mean for how well off we are? Well, there it's better to look at GDP per capita rather than just GDP. So this is what we were expecting in March 2016, again, less than 2 years ago. A relatively steady growth in GDP per capita. There was then a downgrade between March 2016 and March 2017, largely attributed to Brexit. And that change said that we'd be about 1.4% poorer in 2021 than we expected back in March 2016. And what about today? Well, now we've seen an even bigger downgrade, more than 3% lower GDP per capita in 2021 than we expected back in March 2016. And that's not just sort of an economic statistic, that has a real impact for people as well. So what does that, what does that mean for, no. So this is not just a change in the UK. There's actually been a broader slowdown across advanced economies. So this is a forecast from the IMF, expecting GDP per capita to be slowing across a number of different countries in the next few years, so advanced economies, and then a smaller group of advanced economies, the G7, of which the UK is a member. But even compared to these countries, the UK is set to do worse, at least according to the IMF. And if we accumulate GDP per capita growth over the next 5 years, so we ask how much bigger is GDP per capita set to be in 2022 compared to 2016, then according to the IMF, we'd be near the bottom of the pack. If the OBR forecast is right, we'd be right at the bottom of the pack and actually some distance from the rest. So the slowdown in productivity, it's a global problem, but the UK experience is particularly bad. And if productivity is lower, as I say, that's not just an economic statistic, that affects people too. So this is what real earnings have done since 2007. You can see we're still well below those 2007 levels. Back in March 2016, we expected to reach those pre-crisis levels by 2020-21. Even that would have been 12 years of no real wage growth. That's pretty bad. We then have got more pessimistic since then. And so the difference in that forecast is of lower median earnings of £1,400 in 2020-21, a really sizable amount. And we're still not set to be back at pre-crisis levels by 22-23. And in fact, we're still some way away from that. This really is, as Paul said, a remarkably pessimistic forecast. And of course, lower economic activity, lower real earnings, that also means lower tax receipts, and that means higher borrowing. So again, March 2016, less than 2 years ago, it feels a very long time ago in forecasting terms, we were expecting to have a surplus in 2019-20 and to be maintaining that forevermore. In the year between March 2016 and March 2017, that was revised, and it's been revised up again in the long term. So we're now expecting a deficit of £30 billion in 2021-22, a long way away from that £10 billion surplus that we were hoping for in March 2016. So I'm now going to spend a little bit of time thinking specifically about the difference between these two lines, that is, the difference between the forecast back in the budget in March and the forecast now in November. Now, there are three things that might cause this forecast to change, and indeed that contribute to this change. Firstly, there are the classification changes that Paul talked about. They flatter the public finances this time around. Then there are underlying changes, so changes in the economy that then affect the public finances. And then there are the policy changes that the Chancellor chose to undertake in response to that forecast. So firstly, I'm going to talk through changes to the underlying borrowing forecast. And actually, there's a perhaps slightly surprising profile with an improvement in borrowing this year, but then quite a lot worse by the end of the forecast period. The IFS released a report a few weeks ago, and this was our weak scenario, one of our projections. You see that we got it pretty much right. But there we go. So I'm now going to talk a little bit more about why there is this slightly odd profile, and in particular why in 2017-18 the forecast is better, but why in 2021-22, towards the end of the forecast, it's really quite a lot worse. So firstly, 2017-18. So restating the March forecast to account for those classification changes. Back in March, we thought we were going to have a deficit of about £55.5 billion, and that's now about £6 billion lower. Now that's in spite of the fact that the economy's performed more weakly than the March forecast assumed, and is set to perform more weakly over the rest of this year. So there's a productivity downgrade that would have been expected to increase borrowing by about £9 billion. And then there was also an improved hours and employment forecast that would offset some of that. Now, these two things aren't entirely unrelated. Part of what's driving this is if productivity is lower and real wages are lower, the OBR expects that people will work longer, work more hours, in order to try and make up the foregone earnings from that productivity downgrade. So if you'd just seen the economic forecast and didn't know anything else about the public finances this year, you'd actually expect borrowing to be higher than we thought back in March, and yet that's not the case. And that's due to a series of other underlying changes, mostly reflecting stronger than expected public finance data so far this year. And in particular, receipts have performed much more strongly. That's expected to outweigh the weak economic performance in the short run, and therefore about a £6 billion downwards revision to borrowing this year. However, that's not the case in the long run. So if we restate the March forecast accounting for that classification change, we were set to have a deficit of only £11 billion in 2021-22. But then that really large productivity downgrade, again, only about 2/5 of that is offset by the improved hours and employment forecast, and that really outweighs any other underlying changes, which means that before we take into account any policy measures that the government enacted, this is an extra £17 billion of borrowing due to that worse economic forecast. And this again underlines just how important the economy is for the public finances. If the economy is performing badly, it's really hard to reduce the deficit. So those are the underlying changes. That was the forecast that the Chancellor would have seen from the OBR, and then he had to choose, using policy measures, how to respond to that. So what has he done? Well, there's a small fiscal giveaway this year, increasing relatively rapidly over the next 2 years, but then quite a lot smaller in 2020-21 and 2021-22, and Carl's going to talk a bit more about this profile and what's driving that after me. Just focusing on the long run, so that last year, this is a net tax cut of about £1 billion. This is largely another freeze to fuel duties for the 7th year in a row, and the change to stamp duty on for first-time buyers, and some of my colleagues will talk about that later. This is only slightly offset by some anti-avoidance measures. Then there's also a £500 million spending increase, and this is largely on changes to universal credit, which again my colleagues will touch on later. So those are the measures that were announced yesterday, but they're not the only measures that are taking effect over the next few years. There was a large number of measures that were already on the books, already due to filter through over the next few years. And when you take all of that into account, the very small fiscal giveaway today means that we really can't say this is the end of austerity. There's a further £4 billion of net tax rises to come by 2021-22, almost £12 billion of welfare cuts over that same period. And if we wanted to maintain day-to-day departmental spending in per capita terms, so per person, we'd have to spend a further £10 billion by 2022-23. So a lot of more austerity happening over the next few years, leading to a lower deficit. And it really is those measures that are reducing the deficit rather than strong economic growth, because as you've seen, the economy is not growing strongly. And almost all of this is due to be structural borrowing, so it's not a result of the temporary strength or weakness of the economy, but reflects the underlying position of the public finances. Now, the government has a target relating to this cyclically adjusted net borrowing and requires that it be below 2% of national income in 2020-21. On the current forecast, they're still set to hit that with headroom still of about £15 billion. That's down from £26 billion in March, even despite that £5 billion benefit from the change to housing associations. However, there's also another fiscal target that the government has relating to borrowing. That's called the fiscal objective, that we eliminate the deficit entirely by the mid-2020s. And on this plans, that really does look very ambitious indeed. We're set to still have a deficit of more than 1% of national income in 2022-23. So we need to be eliminating that in just 3 years. And that would be after a period where really the deficit had not fallen very quickly at all. That really does seem extremely ambitious. And even that is predicated on them delivering the relatively tight spending plans up to 2022-23. So if you haven't been paying attention to budgets or to politics for the last 18 months, well, you're probably very lucky. But in particular, you'd also be very surprised. And because you'd say, what happened? We were on course. We were going to have a surplus by 2019-20. We were going to run it forevermore. Everything was going to be rosy. And yet now, in 2020-21, we're not going to have a surplus of £11 billion. We're going to have a deficit of over £30 billion. So what happens? So this chart runs through changes to the deficit forecast from March 2016 to November 2017. A lot of this really is a story of underlying changes. Those two big downgrades to the economy in November 2016 and November 2017 mean lower receipts and therefore higher borrowing. But this doesn't account for all of the difference. And actually, policy changes since March 2016, rather than trying to counteract some of this downgrade from the economy, have actually reinforced the effect on borrowing. And these changes alone would have been sufficient to eliminate the surplus that we were due to have in 2020-21. So it's not just a case of economic changes. Policy has also reinforced them over the last couple of fiscal events. So we're not set to be running a surplus, but if we were able to deliver these plans, and that is a big if, we would have borrowing at lower than average levels, about 1% of national income by 2022-23, and perhaps that would be a sustainable level, even if the government weren't able to deliver more savings after that. However, it's not just while the deficit is now back to its pre-crisis levels and is set to go lower, the national debt is still much larger because of the very large deficits that we've run since 2007. Debt as a share of national income remains high above recent history. And you see that it's set to fall, albeit quite modestly, over the next few years. The government has a fiscal target that it must fall as a share of national income in 2020-21. Due to some other financial changes, this is actually very easy to meet. It's not really a binding constraint on the government. But nonetheless, we've got the debt falling, but quite slowly, and that's because the economy is growing quite weakly, and also we've got relatively large deficits over that period. And debt as 80% of GDP is pretty high. We may want to be getting down closer to pre-crisis levels. So how feasible would that be, and how sensitive is that to how large a deficit we run and what happens to growth? So this is a much longer run forecast for debt, looking up to the mid-2060s. So if we assume that productivity growth after the forecast period, so from 2022-23, returns to its norm of about 2% per year, and we ran a deficit of 1% of GDP every year, so that would be the same level that we're due to run in 2022-23. That would be even that would require quite a lot of fiscal tightening, because there are going to be large demographic pressures pushing up spending over that time. But if we were to deliver that and productivity growth were to be 2%, we would be returning debt as a share of GDP to 40% in about 2060. What if instead we decided to do a much larger fiscal tightening, follow those plans from March 2016? That was having a surplus of 0.5% of GDP. Again, assume that productivity growth is the same at 2%. Then we'd get back to 40% at more like 2040. But there's also a much more pessimistic possibility that is indeed pessimistic. It's not a central scenario. But what if the productivity growth that we're due to have towards the end of this forecast period, that's about 1.2% per year, what if that's all we can expect forever? Now, the OBR have said they do expect us to return to 2% at some point. They just don't know when. But say we never return. Say we've just reached a new era of lower productivity growth. And assume as well that we run that deficit of 1.1% of GDP forevermore. Well, then, by the mid-2060s, we'd still have debt above 40% of national income, even after running below average deficits for 50 years. Now, where is Brexit in all of this? I haven't really talked about it at all. As Paul said, this downgrade has not been attributed to Brexit by the OBR, and they still broadly stand by their assessment after the referendum in November 2016 that the public finances will be weaker due to effects on the wider economy. That includes reduced immigration, increased uncertainty, and higher prices. And that's set to be worth about £15 billion per year. That's the central estimate. Now, in this budget, we've seen an extra £3 billion over 2 years to help government departments prepare for Brexit. There's still no allowance in the numbers as it stands for any one-off divorce bill. We don't know when it will be paid, if it will be paid, and indeed how large it will be. Some suggestions have been that it will be about £40 billion. And one possible upside here is that the UK's net contribution to the EU is assumed either to continue or to be spent elsewhere rather than saved. If we were to save it, that could contribute to a lower deficit of about £8 to £10 billion per year, still not outweighing the economic cost, at least as a central estimate. But I think it is important to emphasise this is all incredibly uncertain, that we don't know what effect Brexit will have. We don't know how the economy is going to develop. And so even though there are, I guess, relatively precise numbers on that slide, the important thing to emphasise is there's a really large margin of uncertainty around them. So to summarise, that big downgrade to productivity growth that everyone's been talking about, that's bad news for all of us. That means lower GDP per capita. That means everyone, on average, is less well off. And that's 3.1% lower than we thought less than 2 years ago. And in that time, median wages in 2020 have also been downgraded by £1,400. And this affects the public finance forecast. Underlying borrowing is set to be about £18 billion higher in 2021-22 as a result of these changes to the economy. And rather than choose to offset some of this, the Chancellor's actually decided to loosen policy slightly in response. And that means that while he's still on course to meet fiscal targets for this Parliament, that fiscal objective of eliminating the deficit by the mid-2020s really does seem extremely ambitious.